Hello and welcome to the Power Pod. I'm your host, Matthew Cohen, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with advocate Mark Oppenheimer, who, when he's not in the courtroom, he's appearing on podcasts such as these and is also part of the Truth Report. Mark, it's great to have you on the show. How are you?
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. Appreciate your time. So, Mark, as somebody who's first of all, at the forefront of the legal profession, specifically in South Africa, we know how the legal profession and politics really just seems to collide, especially in current times. We've seen, of course, the unfolding of the Malema firearms case. President Cyril Ramaphosa is under the microscope. And ultimately, there's quite a lot going on when it comes to legislation such as NHI as well. And so, Mark, I'd love for us to start off on the Phala Phala scandal, specifically speaking about the future of Ramaphosa. But before we get into that, I think it's important that we lay the groundwork. So I've been speaking to quite a few different people, and it seems that not everybody's on the same page as to why Phala Phala is so controversial. There's been some people who I've spoken to who said, okay, well, I don't see what he did wrong. Yes, he put money in a sofa. That seems a bit dodgy, but maybe it was legal. Maybe it was a legal sale. There's nothing wrong. And surely if he's using the police to combat the crime, that's what they're supposed to do. So for the naysayers and people who might not be up to speed with what's going on, why exactly was there an issue in terms of criminality surrounding Phala Phala?
There's a couple of reasons. So the one is we still have exchange control rules in South Africa. So you're not entitled to hold on to foreign currency for a period longer than 30 days. So if you've got a couch full of dollars, you have to convert them into rands. You have to declare it. So that's one concern. You might think, for example, that it's arcane that we have exchange control laws in South Africa and that we should abolish them. But the fact is we have them, and everyone is meant to be equal before the law. The second is that the sale itself seems suspicious. So, for example, the allegation is that this Sudanese businessman, arrives with suitcases full of cash in exchange for buffalo, and the buffalo are never taken. So there's an interesting report into who the Sudanese businessman is. He's married to a South African woman, but he also seems to have strong connections with members of the Iranian regime. And so if you think that the money is being sent to our president, not for the sale of buffalo, but for some other purpose, that seems something worthy of investigation. In other words, if you have emissaries of a foreign state handing over money, they could be handing over money for nefarious reasons. If you think about sort of South Africa's relationship with Iran as well, it's been a strange one. So after October 7th, when you had the greatest massacre against Jews since the Holocaust, the ANC government did two things. The one was that they had a conversation with Hamas. Hamas reported on that conversation and said that they were very happy that the South African government had congratulated them on their successful operation. By the way, that operation resulted in killing 1,200 Israelis, kidnapping 251 people, including the Bibas twins, who were newborn infants who were then ultimately killed. And then you had Naledi Pandor flying to Iran to go and meet the Iranians. The South African government has said absolutely nothing about the massacre of 40,000 Iranians who were protesting the regime, and have generally, been exceptionally accommodating of the Iranians. So that implies that they aren't just doing that because it's the right thing to do. They're doing it because there's some transaction going on, and so it's possible that Ramaphosa's couch full of cash has to do with this Iranian connection. The other South Africa-Iran connection is Irancell, which is run by MTN. We know that one of the reasons why you had an internet blackout in Iran when those protesters were murdered was that Irancell turned the internet off. So South Africans have been complicit in the murder of these civilians. And just for one other bit of perspective on that front, there are two public holidays that we celebrate in South Africa because we see them as significant moments. The one is the Sharpeville massacre. So that's commemorated on Human Rights Day when 69 innocent protesters were murdered by the apartheid regime. And the other one is Youth Day when we recognize innocent protesters who were killed in 1976 in the Soweto uprisings. And if you look at the scale of that in comparison to what happened in Tehran, it pales in numbers. And so it's a sickening thing that as South Africans, we recognize as a people that it's wrong to go and kill innocent protesters, but that the ANC government think that there's no problem with that at all.
Right. And I think it's really important, this point that you brought up specifically on the Iran front, because a lot of the time, Mark, we just don't hear this narrative coming from a lot of the legacy media outlets. You know, we hear the sort of superficial arguments being made, but we don't hear about these sorts of sordid connections. So I'm very glad that you brought that up. Now, what we did notice, of course, is that when the scandal first surfaced, we saw that Parliament shut down the notion of there being a commission of inquiry into this. And it is, of course, important for us to remember that it was a majority ANC Parliament. This was prior to the 2024 election. And in recent days, we saw the Constitutional Court make a landmark decision that ultimately invalidated this decision by Parliament to block the inquiry. Now, we have seen how a lot of people they seem to be jumping the gun a little bit, because all of a sudden a lot are discussing potential scenarios of, will Ramaphosa be impeached? What's going to happen in a vote of no confidence? I myself made a video a few days ago speaking about the sort of bargaining powers that different parties could have. But what I'd like to ask you is, if we could just bring it back, how far along in the timeline are we? Are we actually nearing a vote of no confidence, or are there more steps that actually have to take place before that would happen?
So one thing we must look back on is that you had this preliminary report headed by, prior Constitutional Court Judge Ngobo, where it said, well, there seems to be a prima facie case which warrants this impeachment inquiry. At that juncture, the mood in the air was that Ramaphosa would resign. And it was sort of reported as well that he'd received legal advice that he ought to resign. He then didn't. And he performed an incredible magic trick, which is that he said, okay, what I'll do is I'll launch a review of the Noble decision to the Constitutional Court, and then I'll tell the parliamentary body, well, this thing is sub judice, so, you should not engage in an impeachment inquiry. So that's what happens. The Constitutional Court said, hold on, you've jumped the gun. You shouldn't actually be in this court. There's no reason why you deserve direct access. Go and bring your review in the High Court. So he gets kicked out. The parliamentary decision says nothing to see here because there's this ongoing judicial process. A process is started in the High Court, but then seems to have been abandoned. It doesn't continue with the review. Then what you have is ATM and the EFF getting involved in litigation to say, hold on a second, this parliamentary process is improper, and the Constitutional Court agrees and strikes down the rules which allow this to occur. And the EFF put out a statement saying, hold on a second, Ramaphosa has now said, well, hold on, before we engage in any impeachment inquiry, I want to exercise my review rights. And they say, but you already have. You've already launched litigation to review the decision, and then you didn't do anything with it. So if you really wanted to find out whether the report was improper, that time has come and gone. In terms of PAJA, you've got 180 days. So unless you sort of manage to resuscitate that litigation or give an explanation for why you didn't pursue it at the time, there's a difficulty. The other question is whether you could have an impeachment process concurrently. So you might say, well, you're very welcome to go and attack that report in court, but Parliament is entitled to its own process at the same time, unless you get a stay of the parliamentary process. So you could have these things running in parallel. There's also a separate thing, which is the vote of no confidence, which is different from the impeachment, and that requires a lower threshold. So, to have a successful impeachment, you need 2/3 of Parliament, and it impeaches not just the president, but the cabinet. The motion of no confidence will just be in the president and only requires 50+1. And that's the approach that Mkhonto we Sizwe have called for.
I see. And just to clarify, if an impeachment happens, or or really a motion of no confidence, and the motion does actually pass, does that mean that the ANC is able to replace Ramaphosa, or is it a sort of mechanism that triggers new elections, for example?
So I think a lot of people assume that the South African public elect the president. We don't. So we elect political parties. We had an election. We've elected those political parties. The body that elects the president is Parliament. So if Parliament makes a decision, which is that the current president, we have no confidence in him and he cannot be president anymore, Parliament must then have another election to see who the president is. And so you would then have various candidates that would come forward on that basis. But you wouldn't have the need for further national elections or anything like that.
I see. That is actually a very important point that you bring up, Mark, because I actually remember when it came to the swearing in of the ministers and then the vote for the president afterwards, I was busy watching with a few people and they were all quite shocked. And I said, yeah, I'm not surprised that you're shocked, because a lot of people just aren't aware of the fact that we actually don't elect a president directly. It's actually Parliament or the National Assembly who does. So I'm actually kind of glad that you brought that up.
Do you recall who one of the prior candidates for president was?
I think it was Malema, wasn't it?
Yes. So there's a video of the vote count where he gets 36 votes, and then the remainder go to Ramaphosa.
Right. Because isn't it also, just to clarify, I know we're going a little off topic. I guess this is just for my own knowledge, but isn't it also that Parliament can elect or nominate a president? So if, for example, people had the crazy notion of, okay, we in the ANC are going to elect the ACDP leader, they can actually nominate him.
Yes. So the DA in 2014 had said that they would support Ramaphosa as the president of the country. So even though she was in a gang, and so yeah, Parliament can make these sorts of decisions, and basically you don't have to follow a party line. You could say we're going to support so and so because it suits us for these other reasons. For example, it might very well be the case that the EFF and MK recognize that they couldn't get their own candidate to be supported as president, but they then pick someone else. We find this at a local government level. So, for example, in Johannesburg, we've had 2 mayors from Al Jamar. Al Jamar has, I think, 3 seats in the city council. So 2 of their councillors were mayor, out of 270 seats. So basically, the other parties couldn't agree, and so they said, fine, we'll have a compromise candidate and we'll have these, 2 nut jobs from Al Jamar run the place into the ground.
Right. No, I realize maybe for some who are watching at home, this might seem a little off topic, but I think it is very important that we discuss this process, right? Because ultimately we need to remember that Ramaphosa is not the ANC. He's the leader of the party, sure, but he's one personality. And of course, now with all of this going on and his future being uncertain, I think it's important for us to assess, where might the ANC's headspace be? Because on one hand, they could scramble to protect him. There are many polls that have come out saying that he is quite a popular personality. But then on the other hand, they might be looking at succession planning. We've heard the names such as Patrice Motsepe being mentioned as potential successors. That seems to be generating quite a lot of enthusiasm amongst some crowds. And so I'd really like to pick your brain now, Mark, and feel free to answer from a legal perspective or just a political analysis perspective. What do you think is probably the most logical way for the ANC to tackle this? Do they rush to protect Ramaphosa, or do they basically boot him out the door?
Well, they have rushed to protect him. So, when the NEC met, they say they unanimously decided that they intend on backing him. I suppose the question is why. Ramaphosa strikes me as one of the most disappointing presidents in modern South African history. I think many people were caught up in a Ramaphoria. You saw it in the Rand. So, especially after the kind of dark Zuma years, people were so, upset that they wanted some kind of strong leadership. And you saw the Rand soar to about 11.30 to the dollar. And then quite quickly, people realized that Ramaphosa wasn't this wonderful businessman who cared about constitutional values. People started thinking, which businesses did Ramaphosa start again? Oh, yeah, there aren't any. He seems to be given, shares on companies and has, become enormously wealthy, really through sort of an extended kleptocracy. But, you're dealing with either someone who has no substance or someone who is a really rabid socialist. So if you look at the kinds of laws that have come out under Ramaphosa, you have him championing expropriation of compensation. And many people said, no, Ramaphosa's playing 4D chess and he doesn't actually believe in this. It's just a way of satiating the RET faction in the party. There's hundreds of hours of Ramaphosa saying, we will confiscate people's land and we will give them nothing. He puts in, signs into law NHI, signs into law the Expropriation Act, signs into law Bella. Like, this is a person who also refers to, we're doing this for our people. So, Monsieur Lakota from COPE said, hold on a second, South Africa is a nation for all who live in it. When you say our people, who do you mean? And the assumption was he means black people. I actually don't think that's the case. I don't think Ramaphosa cares about black people at all, one iota. I think when he says our people, what he means is a very, very small elite crew of people who have made an enormous amount of money by ripping off South Africans. So if you look at the nature of BE policies, for example, William Gomedi's report says only about 100 families made R1 trillion. There's no broad base, there's no upliftment, there's no sense of caring about the average South Africans. The ANC and Ramaphosa are very happy to sell them down the river for his own very narrow set of interests. That's the kind of person we're dealing with. Thankfully, we are no longer in a situation where the ANC is the sole decider of who the leadership will be. Their support has crashed down from 57.5% to 40%. And continues to flatline. So you may very well have a situation where it doesn't matter who the ANC picked to be their leader, the president of the country will come from some other party.
That's a very interesting prospect, and it's a funny thing because there's that one side of me, and I'm sure a lot of people at home thinking, it just feels impossible, that you're not going to have an ANC president. But yeah, looking at the numbers and specifically the trends and how they are just plummeting every election, I think what you said, Mark, really does make a lot of sense. Like, the day will come, whether it's 2029 or the election after that, the president will no longer be the one who is the president of the ANC. So it's an interesting call. It's very interesting. But I would like to pivot a moment to another important topic, specifically NHI. So, of course, we know that since NHI was introduced as a bill, it's been very controversial. A lot of people have been worried about what will happen to their private health care. They're worried because, of course, so many people feel that the tax burden that's been placed on them is just so astronomical, and now it's probably going to rise even more. But as much as people panicked, it does seem almost as if the act is in a state of limbo. Now, you did mention to me before we started recording that there's been quite a significant development in court regarding the NHI case. And so I'd like to ask you, firstly, if you can break down for all of us what this breakthrough is and what sort of an implication it will have. So basically, will it make it more difficult for NHI to actually be applied in practice?
So there's two things that have been happening almost concurrently. The one is a challenge to the certificates of need. So the idea is that as a doctor, the state could determine whether you're entitled to practice within certain parts of the country, often certain services. And so the idea is that, the state knows best, and the state thinks it's very important that, certain people get forced to, stop operating in a place like Sandton or Cape Town and move to the middle of nowhere and offer their services there. Without thinking, you will have a lot of people who say, well, if I can't practice, where my friends and family are in the city that I want to live in, I will leave and I will go somewhere else. And so you will erode the private healthcare sector gigantically. Constitutional Court said, we actually have a constitutional right to freedom of trade and occupation. and that this is an infringement of that right and one that cannot be justified, and they struck down those clauses. So that case was brought by Solidarity. By the way, like, talk of like fear-mongering or overly panicked, the state is very happy to put through a series of totalitarian laws. And thank God that we have organizations like Solidarity and AfriForum, the Free Market Foundation, and the Institute of Race Relations that are willing to go to court, expose themselves to enormous amounts of pressure from the state and from the press, and take these risks on behalf of the public so that they can do what's right. And so Solidarity have done an enormously good thing for the healthcare sector. What you unfortunately find as well is that a lot of people in private businesses are very cowardly. They are concerned that if they take a strong stance, if they speak out, that they'll be punished by the state. And so often it is up to civil society organizations to have this fight. And thankfully, our judiciary still has independent pockets who care about the protection of our constitution and the rule of law. And so these pernicious laws are then struck down. Solidarity have also brought another challenge, which is to the constitutionality of the act. And then the DA have brought a challenge to the procedural aspects of how it was passed into law. So the Constitutional Court heard argument about a month ago about whether the public participation process was adequate. And so if it turns out that it was inadequate, they could strike down the law in its entirety or refer it back to Parliament. What that probably does is kill it. Because as you mentioned, the composition of Parliament has changed dramatically since that law was signed into effect. So unless the DA really sell their voters down the river, if NHI gets pushed back to Parliament, it's dead. And so that would be an enormous win. One of the things that's kind of incredible about South Africa is that our private healthcare it exceeds some of the healthcare that you would find in America and Canada and the UK on three things. The one is it's very good. You have incredibly competent doctors who are specialists in their field. You can readily get it quite quickly. So we take for granted that if you are sick right now, you can go to the doctor of your choice and get seen today. If you live in the UK, that is not something that you can take for granted at all. You'll be put on a waiting list, and maybe one of these days we'll get around to seeing you. We might not. It's incredibly hard to see a doctor. And actually, comparatively, healthcare in South Africa is pretty affordable. So a lot of my friends who live abroad will fly to South Africa to get the operations done because it'll be better, cheaper, and quicker than it will be, in these other developed countries. So if you think about South Africa generally, the private sector is incredibly good. The kinds of services that we have, the quality that we have is absolutely world class. The state, on the other hand, has what I call the reverse Midas touch. Everything it touches turns to shit. If you compare, let's say, before Leon Schreiber took over Home Affairs, think about your time standing in a Home Affairs office trying to get the government to issue you a new ID card, and then compare that to walking into a Vodacom store and getting a cell phone and how different those experiences are. We want a lot less state and more private stuff. And thankfully, as our government fails and becomes more and more inefficient, the private sector has filled the void.
Right, I couldn't agree more. And like you said, it's so important that we have these civil society organizations fighting the fight and limiting the sort of state overreach, if we can call it that. And yes, I have to second what you said about the private sector. I mean, I myself, I know quite a lot of people, even through personal experiences of my own, where if you compare the way that healthcare and the entire healthcare system works in South Africa to other places, there's a very big efficiency gap. So I definitely have to agree with you there, especially when it comes to actually setting appointments. I mean, I've spoken to certain people that when it comes to advanced procedures, especially surgeries and stuff like that, they're on waiting lists for weeks, if not months. And like you mentioned, even just seeing a doctor can take days, if not weeks. So definitely a very relevant point to end off on, Mark. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I hope that the viewers at home found it as insightful as what I did. And before we part ways, for those who are interested in following what you've been up to and hearing more of your thoughts on these sorts of important matters, where can people follow you?
So there's two different YouTube channels that are worth having a look at. The one is Mark Oppenheimer, where you can see a list of all of my court appearances and podcast interviews. There's probably about 200 by now. And then I run a philosophy discussion show called Brain in a Vat, which I've been doing with my good friend Jason Werbelov for the last 6 years. Quite different. So we interview academic philosophers from around the world, often in the States, Australia, the UK, South Africans. So if you're interested in some weird and wonderful conversations, have a look at Brain in a Vat.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, thanks very much for coming on the show. Appreciate your time.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks everybody for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it and you found it insightful, please remember to follow the channel for more content and be sure to subscribe to Mark's YouTube channels as well. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen and this is the Power Pod.